I'm Rob Havard, and this is Call to the Land. Welcome to another episode, and really excited that this week we've got our guest, William Castle. Hello, William.
Hi, thanks.
Thanks for coming down. Really appreciate you coming. Now, William, I'm just going to plug the book first. I thoroughly enjoyed this book. You can see it's very well thumbed. Some beautiful prints in here as well. Really recommend you have a look at this. I'll do this at the start. Working Horses. And I think it's working-horses.com, isn't that right?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, so have a look. Well worth buying. And I think, if you ever want to learn how to set up a plough for a horse, then that's your thing. But there's some really nice stories in there and a lot about what we'll probably get through talking today, William. So once again, thanks for coming on.
You're welcome. Nice to be here.
Thank you. And and I think probably brief introduction. So obviously you're an author, a smallholder, horseman, and a violin maker as well.
Yeah, it's some people wonder why such a peculiar combination of different things, but it actually is quite natural, all those things for me. Perhaps some of it coming from childhood and my background, but also my interests in doing practical things both outside on the land and in the workshop.
Okay, and so how did you get into farming and using horses and that? So did you grow up on a farm? Or?
Yeah. My dad was a farm manager, so he was managing a farm of when we first went there when I was 3, it was probably about 400 acres, and then as tenants retired, those farms got taken in hand. So by the end, he was sort of farming 2,000 acres.
Wow.
So I grew up with all that happening in the background. It was slightly to distance because we lived in what had been a tented farmhouse, so we were away from the main part of the farm. But from the age of 13, I used to work on the farm in some holidays, and then a bit in Easter holidays and things. So that was sort of my background. But my dad, even then, so I was born in 61, so that was the mid-70s when I was a teenager. He was seeing that farming was getting harder and harder, so it was not anything that he really recommended for either of his 3 sons. Although I enjoyed doing the farm work, I actually went off to do other things, being a violin maker. And I suppose the other thing, the big influence at that time was I bought a copy of John Seymour's Self-Sufficiency, which had just come out. So that it was a book that was sort of aimed at the back to the land movement of the 1970s. But to me as a teenager, it made quite a lot of sense, especially as the market for farm produce, it was getting harder. So why not just grow stuff for yourself?
Yeah.
But also in there, he had a chapter about using a horse, and that thought was interesting. And I actually went to my dad's office and found some of his old books, because he was learning farming around the time of the Second World War, including a little booklet that the Young Farmers Club produced called Farm Horses, which was produced in the war. So that was sort of in the background for me all that time. But then I went to learn violin making. I worked in Germany for 3 years and came back and set up on my own.
So how did you get to how does that come about? Do you see an advert? Is it something you really wanted to do? Or?
What, the violin making?
The violin making, yeah.
Well, I always liked making things.
Yeah.
And I had a woodwork teacher at school who'd made guitars and Northumbrian small pipes and a few other things. And because I was good at woodwork and interested in music, he suggested I might want to make a simple instrument. So I started doing that, and I liked it. And then I got a place at a college in Newark in Nottinghamshire, which one of the few places where you could learn violin making. Wow. So I did that straight after sixth form.
Gosh. And then that led to Germany.
That led to a job in Germany working for a firm doing restoration work, and with a lot of top instruments coming through. So that was a really good start for that.
Yeah.
And then after 3 years, I came back and went self-employed and was living in the outskirts of York. But I was still, I'm not a natural city dweller by any stretch of the imagination. And so I was sort of thinking of how I'd get out and actually become more involved with farming in a way. But then my mum saw an advert for a little article, I think it was, in a Sunday newspaper about a place that ran courses on working horses. And I went to that. That was down in Sussex. And from that, I found out about Jeff Morton in Yorkshire, which was 25 miles away from where I lived. So I immediately enrolled on one of his courses,
Right.
and then I got to work on his farm, and that was fundamental in my understanding of what horses could do, as well as re-engaging me back with farming again.
So what was Jeff's farm like? What was that?
Well, I wrote about it in the book because I rewrote the first chapter, so to give a bit of an idea of what it was like there to go to the first time. And you drove up the lane, and it was no different from any farm lane. You got to the farmhouse, typical brick buildings, around a fold yard. Except this fold yard was used; it was full of straw, and it was full of working horses in the winter. And everything was geared around the horses. So the first thing you did in the morning was to get the horses in, to feed the horses in the stable, and put harness on them if they were going to be working that day, or whichever ones were going to be working that day. So they farmed 150 acres, and their main thing was thatching straw, because thatching straw needs to remain straight, so it can't go through a combine. It has to go through a threshing machine,
Right.
transversely, so the straw's not broken, which means you have to cut the wheat or rye with a binder.
Yeah.
And you might as well do that with horses as well as the tractor. There's disadvantages and advantages of both, but that meant all the harvesting was done in the traditional manner. And it was the markup on the thatching straw that allowed them to do it in the slower method.
And that made the difference, because they were making a bit more on the straw.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, the straw was worth more than the grain that was on the top of it.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
And you mentioned the fold yard.
Yeah.
So what is that? Was that like a cobble yard, or
Yeah,
a fenced yard with straw in? Or?
No, it was a stoned yard, and then there was a raised pathway around the edge, so from which all the stables and all the buildings had access. And then the bottom of the fold yard was perhaps another 16 inches below that, and then it dipped down to the middle. So what we did in the winter, the horses were in there at night loose, and we just unrolled a bale or big round bale or two of straw each night, and put a bale of barley straw in the ring feeder, which is where they got their forage, the roughage from, and then in the daytime, the main horses we used most were in the stable, and the other ones were tied up under the sheds around the fold yard, at great long mangers, so we could feed them straight into that.
Yeah, but they'd have been in stalls, or
yeah, in the stable. The ones in the stable were in stalls. Yeah, individual stalls. So, which is an easy way of looking after them for harnessing and stuff, because they're exactly where you need to be, and you can have all the harness hung up just behind the horses, so it's just there where you need it. Whereas if you had a loose box, they'd be knocking it off the pegs or whatever. So, and you'd have to carry the harness. So it's a very efficient way of keeping the horses. And then, of course, even if they weren't working in the daytime or in the stables, at the night time, they were in this fold yard with a deep layer of muck, so it was actually hard walking. So they used to run around and walk about. So they actually got exercise, which is the problem if you keep them in a loose box. They just don't get enough movement. And of
No.
course, they're socialising as well. That's the other thing that makes a big difference.
Yeah, and it keeps them happy.
Yeah.
And then presumably they've grown forage as well and hay as well. Or?
Yeah, I mean, the horses, and this is quite common in the eastern counties in the past, the old horses were fed straw in the past, often oat straw or barley straw as their basic to fill the bellies. And very little hay was grown, but the young stock they were fed hay in the winter because they've got a great need for nutrients to grow. When they're because young cart horses have got a lot of growing to do.
Yeah.
So and then they all used to get fed rolled oats mixed with what we used to call calf in Yorkshire, which is strict speaking, it's the glooms, which is the little papery covering that covers each individual grain of wheat and oats. You can't use barley because of the awns.
So that would have been what had been threshed out.
Yeah, that comes out with the threshing machine.
Yeah.
So the grain comes out at one end, the long straw comes out at the other end, and down below comes the broken straw, and then all the light stuff, all the chaff, the calf, is blown out through a blower, and then all their oats was fed with this calf, which sort of slowed down their eating, which is what you need to do when you're feeding a lot of oats to horses, is to mix it with roughage so they don't sort of bolt it too quick.
Yeah. So then you'd have had a sickle bar mower for haymaking, or would that have been done on farm, or
yeah, it had been by the time I was there, which was late 80s. They actually used to cut that with a tractor. There was about 80% of the work was done with the horses.
Yeah.
But some of the autumn ploughing and occasionally some of the cultivation and the cutting the hay and also big baling was done with the tractor. They had used sickle bar mowers, but sickle bar mowers are a very pedantic machine. They need to be set up just right to work efficiently, and if they're already 50 or 70 years old, there's a lot of slop in them, and that adds to the draft and the inefficiency of the cutting.
Right, so it's hard for the horses to pull.
So it's really hard for the horses to pull. I mean, we had a neighbour next door to us where we are now, and he used to say that cutting hay, mowing hay was, there were horse killers were mowers. I mean, that was partially because in grassland areas, the horses weren't very fit because they're not been doing much in the spring, so they weren't fit when they came to it. But also had to do with the how well the mowers were maintained. So for instance, I have a sickle bar mower, but I got it from America in a completely reconditioned, so it basically as new, and that's a much more efficient one than one that you can't get quite the spare parts for because it's 70-year-old and hadn't been made for 70 years probably.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting you mentioned America as well, because there does seem to be over there quite a strong community of people using working horses for farming, for haying, obviously for things like threshing straw, that sort of stuff as well.
Yeah, it's quite different in America, and the basic reason is, to my mind, is that they've got a lot of space in America compared with us. So that if we're not making the best of the last 5 acres, your neighbours will be looking over your fence and saying, "What on earth are you doing?" Whereas if you're not making the most of the last 100 acres in some places in the States, nobody bothers. So you could easily keep plenty of horses. So that's one side of it.
Yeah.
The other thing is that the Amish and old order Mennonites that in America continues to use horses and mules, and in quite large quantities as well. So over the last sort of 30, 40 years, they've actually developed companies that make new horse-drawn machinery in America. So,
and that's the Amish and Mennonites doing that
largely, but it's not completely. I remember when I went over in 2011, I was talking to one of the manufacturers, and he was saying the increase in custom was actually bigger amongst the non-Amish people than it was amongst the Amish.
Yeah.
So there are other people who like horses and can use horses, and it's never got down to as low as it did do over here.
Yeah. Well, I think it's, I've got a book called Why Cows Have Names. And it's actually a book about the Amish community over there and how they have these sort of filters to put decisions through, because a lot of people think that they just avoid all technology. But I think different communities have slightly different rules.
Yeah, that's right.
But I think there was in there, one of the key things was, does it build community, was the question. And so obviously if you're going to minimise the amount of labour required from people, then that was something that, well, we're not going to have that. But they do have motors, they do have engines that might work within a shed for carrying out an operation, or sometimes they'll even pull a motorised cart with the horses that's got a PTO drive on it, but the actual traction comes from the horses pulling. And I just really love that, and putting a filter of all your sort of cultural, technological advances. I just think like maybe that's time has come again for us, because we're on this race to technology at the moment, and it's like, how much more technology do we need, and is it really doing us any good? And that's a sort of big question about what we could do. Maybe we could learn from the Amish on that front as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's not just now that that's happening. It's just happening in different ways. If the questions that a farmer might ask, or anybody in business, in fact, is it going to save me time? Is it going to save me money? And as those are the only decisions that possibly have any justification. And really, because saving time is saving money. So basically down to one question, money. Whereas, I mean, even from a teenager, I suppose, and reading John Seymour, it goes back to then. I wanted to do something that was useful with my life.
Yeah.
So whether it was making violins for people to play, or whether it was doing my work with horses, or even writing a book, and is it fulfilling for me? Because as far as we know, we only get one crack at this life. So why do we want to live a life that is not fulfilling those needs, just because it might make a bit more money? Because once you actually get into what you want to do and what you're excited about doing, once you really know your job, you see other ways that you can actually find a way forward, which are not necessarily the quickest or the bit that would happen to satisfy your bank manager the most.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and I think that's something that's come up in previous podcasts, and particularly we had Chris Smage on talking about small farms, and this subject's come up, and this sort of pursuit at scale and money at all costs, really, and then where that might take farming. In terms of our local community, if every farm gets bigger, then that's fewer farms, and that's fewer farmers. That's fewer people in the local pub, in the local church, in the local school. And so we might say, well, this is the only way forward, is to get bigger and go big or go home. But then there'll be less people to go home. And so it just seems like we kind of need to reassess a little bit, a bit like the Amish. And the interesting thing is not only is there a real focus on community there, but from my understanding, and I looked this up a while ago, so I think it's still the case, but they are the fastest growing class of landowner in the United States, and they're incredibly financially successful. And particularly, often it's a dairy farm, and they're growing their own maize, they're harvesting maize with horses, but they're doing everything with such low costs because the horses replace themselves. They haven't got all these machinery bills. They don't have a fuel bill apart from what they grow from sunlight, energy, and the fact that it rains. And actually, if we want to take, if people are saying, more land is better, well, they're the fastest growing landowners, but they're just more small farms as well. It's not just bigger farms. So I think maybe we could learn something if they're so financially successful as well.
Yeah, I mean, part of the reason of that, as you suggest, is they've internalized all their costs. So, for instance, they don't have insurance. So if the barn burns down, the family whose barn has burnt down, they foot the bill for the materials, but then the whole community comes together to put the barn, and then it's a typical sort of Amish scene of a barn raising where you have hundreds of people raising the structure of a post and beam barn.
Yeah. You see these sort of videos online as well sometimes of like 200 or 300 people lifting a huge barn, and they're just walking with it. And put it where they need to put it.
I mean, and that's the strength of community. I mean, on a much smaller scale, when I built a pole barn about 10 years ago, and so I did all the joints as far as they went, which was basically telegraph poles with beams in between, so that it was so I flat packed it basically, and then had friends come to lift it. And there was a farmer up the road who came with his telehandler, and I didn't know him all that well. And at the end of the day, so I said, "How much do I owe you?" He said, "Well, if you just pay me for the diesel," he said, "that'll be fine." He said, I've enjoyed it so much because it was a group of friends, so smallholders, other practical people, just getting together to do a job. And we had a great time. And we got the barn put up. And that's one of the things that is missing in so much of life. I mean, particularly in rural life, that we would notice it, but also, otherwise, because actually working together towards a common goal is about the most satisfying thing you can do.
Yeah, and even for those people more focused on the money side of things, if they're saying, well, it's all very well focusing on community, but then what you've just said there has actually shown the economic value of community, where actually not only do you have everyone around and you've got all this support network around you, but also they come and solve your financial hardship problem of the barn burning down. So that is an investment in something tangible in terms of the future. And then I also wonder, in a similar way, that just made me think about stories of my grandfather who grew up in the Black Mountains in Wales, where all the people at the moment are often complaining that, and probably rightly so, they don't get enough for the wool clip, and it costs more to shear the sheep. If you get shearers in, my dad was a contract shearer. It costs more to shear the sheep than you get for the fleece. But in the past, people would gather the hill flocks all together into one place. Then all the farms and the farm sons would all come together, and everyone would shear together rather than everyone doing it separately. And so, which is the same sort of principle really. And then obviously that was a community event. Everyone came together. The shearing got done. Didn't cost you anything in terms of money, but now it does. And this is where all of these costs kind of bleed out of our businesses, and then understandably we say it's hard to make a living at it. But
yeah, and there's the other side of it as well, which I was thinking about on the way here, to do with wool, and the problem with wool in a capitalistic economy nowadays is that you've got to have all the sheep, keep the wool clean, all the shearing, as you say, and then all the processing and the dyeing and everything before it's finally made into a jumper. It's actually much cheaper to make out of polyester, and everybody buys polyester stuff because it's cheaper. But of course that uses quite a lot of energy, and when in the end, what have you got? You've got a load of stuff that is just fit for landfill. Whereas with wool, in fact, just 2 days ago, I got rid of a jumper because I tend to hold things against my belly, and had a big hole in it, nearly the size of a football. So I put it on the compost heap. Now it'll take a couple of years to rot down, but it was pure wool, so it will do. And it just seems bonkers that we're producing all this stuff wool and nobody's using it when it's a fantastic material. Instead, we're using stuff that's going to last for thousands of years in landfill sites. It's and that just because, as coming back to what I said, often the only factor people actually tend to consider is money and profit, whereas and a lot of the extra costs are not accounted in their accounting system. So take my jumper for instance. That's just going to rot down and it'll go on the garden eventually when it's rotted down. Whereas who pays for the landfill? Who pays for the landfill and then monitoring the methane build-up in landfill and all that sort of stuff? That cost is not met by the company that's produced the polyester jumpers. So
it's a big problem with the socialised cost, isn't it? Similarly with the cleaning up of the rivers, which get cleaned up by the water companies, but then the water companies, I mean, we're told they're privatised, but essentially the government has to keep bailing them out to keep cleaning the water. And there's a recent thing we're Severn Trent water area, and they were giving grants out to farmers about sort of spray stalls and trying to keep chemicals out of the rivers in terms of managing riparian areas along rivers, river corridors, and all of that stuff. And in terms of, for every £100,000 they spent on grants to the farmers, they were saving £1 million in terms of cleaning up the water.
Yeah.
Now, that's all being borne by everybody who pays a water bill. And it's not being borne by the people who make the chemicals that have to be taken out of the water. No. Whether that could be not just agricultural chemicals, but domestic chemicals, the contraception pill, all of that stuff has to be cleaned up. But who's picking up the bill? It's us, isn't it?
Yeah. That's a big problem. I was also thinking about nitrogen in watercourses as well, because of course that's been an ongoing thing. And I looked at the map a couple of months ago of all the nitrate sensitive areas in the country, and they were almost exactly the arable areas. The grassland areas tended not to be in those, letting the nitrates out. And I was just thinking about all that manufactured chemical nitrogen that's being put on the ground, that it's just being washed into the rivers. It's just like throwing money away at the same time as polluting the rivers.
By definition, if it's in the rivers, it's not in the fields.
Exactly, it's not growing the crops if it's in the rivers. And of course, it's sort of, you're backtracking from that. The reason why farmers do it, obviously, is to grow the crops, but it's because it's cheap enough to use carelessly. Now, I know that's changed, especially since the war in Ukraine and things, but we don't seem to take the energy cost, into account. I mean, I read something, and the figures varies depending on which sources you take, but on average, it says farming uses 5 units of energy nowadays to produce 1 energy in the form of food. So that's 5 calories of energy in the form of oil originally, mostly, to produce 1 calorie of food. Well, that's completely bonkers, because if you were as a business said, I'm going to it cost me 50 quid to buy my raw materials and I'm selling my final product for £10, you think that's completely uneconomic. So
the only thing that's changing there is the value of each type of energy, isn't it? It's just basically taking some cheaper versions of energy and then producing less energy. And it's really interesting you mentioned that, because actually this came up on a previous podcast episode, but a friend of mine in Scotland, Angus, recently been working out conventional beef systems, and he came up to the same figure that you did, that it took about 5 times as much energy to produce, in terms of calories of energy, to produce the amount of beef that you produce in a conventional system. Whereas his system, which is probably slightly less productive overall, but it's all come from sunshine and rain, and he doesn't have to do much with it. Still producing a lot of really good beef and at decent stocking rate levels. So just to be clear, but he is about 1-to-1
Yeah.
on that lower input system. So in terms of like, if that energy, and I think that's what we're finding now with farmers, with record high cattle prices, but the input prices are now sky high as well because of monetary inflation. And so if you're producing that 1/5 in terms of energy output, then those 5/5 that you're having to buy in, if the price of those goes up, it has a much bigger impact than your sale price, and you can then see that difference because you're buying more energy than you're getting in terms of output and what you're selling. So it's a really interesting point, and I think as energy becomes more expensive, and it looks like that's going to continue, this is all going to sort of punch us pretty hard in the face, isn't it?
Yeah, and the thing is, most people would say, if you think about energy, probably outside of farming, but think, oh yeah, those great huge tractors, they must use a lot of diesel, and of course they do. But then there's so many extra stages. There's the natural gas that they use to make nitrogen fertilizer and the energy that it makes there, and then it's got to be shipped to the farm. And then at the other end of the stage, there's the potatoes that go off to the wholesalers, let's say in the east of England, from here, from Worcestershire, and then it goes out to the supermarket, so it goes to their distribution back in Worcestershire again before it goes out to Herefordshire and somewhere else. And that's a lot of it, of course. And the pesticides, or made in chemical works, of course, there's a lot of energy that goes into there. So it's sort of huge, really. I mean, I used to hate it when, I suppose it was 30 years ago, that people started referring to farming as the farming industry, because up until then, industry had been stuff you made in factories. But actually, it's quite accurate, because often it's so much inputs and so much outputs, whereas farming used to be making food from what appears to be nothing, basically the fertility in the soil, and as you say, the sun and the rain. So yeah, I think and that process just seems to be getting worse. I mean, partially because it's bigger.
Yeah, and what we talked about a bit earlier with the community aspect as well, it's valuing what you describe, and those things like the shared, the hill gathers to shear all the sheep, and making something of that, and valuing that culture and community, which you go abroad to places like Switzerland and parts of France and Spain, northern Spain, and you see these cultures that are really celebrated, and you can watch all the cows being taken to the hills, taken up to the mountain pastures in Switzerland, and there's a big deal made of it. There's a big procession. All the cows will have their big cowbells on, and then the farmers will hang the cowbells on the hill pasture, on the walls of the hill pasture cow sheds, and there's a real sense of this is important, and also it sort of marks the seasons, and all of these things that sort of tie us to a place, and I think it's important.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to get sort of too stuck in the idea that all old traditions are fantastic and that's how things should be, because it's not how I see it. But there's something about the connection to place which is really important.
Yeah.
For all sorts of people, whether it's supporting your local football team or buying food from a local farm shop or whatever it is. And it's been quite noticeable how in my lifetime you could the characteristics, the character of farms in different parts of the country was a lot more diverse when I was a youngster than it is now. They're much more the same. All the tractors are green or red, whereas they used to be all sorts of different colours. I mean, just a stupid example, really. But the way, the different traditions and the different rotations and all that sort of stuff that were suited to particular areas, and that's sort of being homogenised with It's sort of like a cookie cutter, one size fits all approach, which culturally it makes a huge difference. But actually, I think agriculturally is not the best approach. You know, in the old days, they used to say a farmer would just, when taking on tenancy, farm wouldn't do much for the first year or two until it worked out what the soil was like. Well, you couldn't do that nowadays, but there is a point to actually understanding what your land is like and what your farm is like.
Yeah.
And
that's something that we use a system called holistic management. And one of the key things when you start doing that is where possible, and it's not always possible, but where possible is to leave it fallow for at least 12 months. So you can watch it and look at the soil, see how it grows without, stocking it and everything, rather than just throw everything at it and see what you can make it do. But yeah.
I did a course in organic farming in Aberystwyth at the Royal Welsh Agricultural College in about 1990, and the first day we were taken into a field with some spades and we had to dig some holes, and it was probably the best lesson that we ever had, because once you get 3 foot down, you can see all the different layers and different parts of the field and see how the soil changes. That's really where you can see where you've got a problem. Even putting a spade in, or you can feel where the compaction is, and that sort of thing. And it's that sort of very basic understanding that just doesn't seem to feature a lot in conventional agriculture. I mean, it's changing, as of course, with things like you were talking about here, but
I think it is changing, isn't it? But I think I think you make a really good point about, you might see the Amish, or people might see the Amish as a more extreme version of this, but there is still something about what they do, which is they will take technology on if they can see it benefits. But they'll just be careful, and so a lot of them often work as carpenters on the side of the farms, and so they might need a mobile phone. But if you have a little a hamlet of farms, and the houses tend to be close together, and then the farms spread out, and in the middle of that they had a little they made a phone box, and all of everyone's mobile phones were kept in this phone box, so they were not allowed in the houses. And actually, with the way it is with smartphones and my kids, and trying to keep them off them, and it's an impossible task. But actually, you think, well, as much as people might mock the Amish, well, they're the ones actually taking responsibility to try and make sure these things aren't harming our kids. And from what we understand about these smartphones, I mean, essentially giving some, psychological cocaine to young teenagers. It's not the best thing we're doing, and we're just allowing it because we don't have these systems to kind of manage what is beneficial and what isn't. And so the main point here is that yes, we embrace technology, and I think that's what mainstream farming is doing. But what's good is that a lot of those lessons of organic farming are now being sort of taken in with regenerative agriculture, or even just a slightly more regenerative approach and focus on soil. And I think where we do blend things, and we do really think about not just the bottom line for that year, but the fact that you've got to do this in ad infinitum, I think that's where we can actually really improve things, and it doesn't take that long to sort it out.
No, I've read somewhere about an Amish farmer talking about taking over a farm that had been farmed conventionally beforehand, and it was a very simplistic sort of idea. And he said, well, after about 6 years of us farming as we do, it'll be about right again. And there's obviously a lot to unpack behind that, because first of all, they'll be doing alternate farming or lay farming, essentially. So they'd be putting it down to grass and clover, maybe alfalfa over there, and then ploughing it up for a while and growing crops, and then going back to a forage crop and grazed land. But also they'd be ploughing it with horses, and the thing about ploughing with horses, the first is you never plough as deep as some people tend to plough with tractors, because it's all wasted effort. And if you've got horses in front of you, that are struggling, there's something wrong. Either you're ploughing too many furrows or too deep, or your horses aren't fit, or something like that. So, in fact, I've mentioned it in the book. There was a study done in Germany by the University of Kiel, and this was on a biodynamic farm. So you'd think the soil would be in pretty good health. And they had 2 parallel plots next to each other, and they grew the same crops on the same dates using the same machinery on both plots. But the only difference was that the motive power on one plot was a tractor, and on the other plot they used either 1 or 2 horses, depending what implement they were using. And after a while of following the rotation through, they found that the air space, the pore space in the soil that could be filled with air or water, depending how much it rained, was 40% greater on the horse-powered plot than it was on the tractor-powered plot. And that was the only difference. It was either tractor or
40% greater.
40% greater. So what does that mean? Well, it obviously means that the horses hadn't compacted the soil as much as the tractor had done, so there's more space. But the next stage is thinking, if there's more pore space, what does that mean? Well, it means that air can go into the soil much more easily. And therefore, in the spring, as the air warms up, if it can get in more easily, it's going to warm the soil up more quickly. So therefore, you're going to be able to sow earlier. If it rains a lot, if the soil can hold 40% more moisture before it starts to either infiltrate down or run off the top. So, and in a dry time, I mean, the pore space, obviously there's large pores and small pores, but with that organic matter that being there, that they actually will retain moisture better than otherwise. So it was an absolute win-win. But perhaps the most interesting point about that little experiment was that the tractor they used was only a small one. It weighed about a ton, which was less than the combined weight of the 2 horses. Well, the tractor that only weighs a ton is tiny. So if that was the case with a ton, just imagine what a 10-ton tractor is doing to the soil as it goes across it. I mean, I can understand. I know that I can feel the feeling in my hands still, because once when I was at the Morton's farm and I was ploughing with a pair of horses, somebody had driven a tractor across this piece of ground when it was really wet. And you'd go along with the plough and you'd have to brace yourself every time you got to where these ruts were, because the plough would just sort of jiggle, and you could see the horses just leaning because it was jolting then. And that's one of the things about horses. If you pay attention, you can actually see the efforts, and so you want to adjust it. You want to make things so that it works as easily as possible. Whereas with the tractor, you might just shove it down a gear and you blast on through.
No, that is interesting, isn't it? And I think there's something about the hoof action as well, because people often will talk about, well, these big tractors have got big tyres, and the pounds per square inch is actually less or whatever. But even if it's slightly less, it's still covering quite a large area.
Exactly. Yeah.
And I think this is the thing that soil and hooves have been working together probably for millions of years.
Yes, of course. Yeah.
And so, even with cattle across a field, we'll notice there'll be cattle hoof prints, and the pounds per square inch is probably higher than a tractor tire on those. But it's only where the quad bike's gone that the compaction is.
Yeah.
And I think that's exactly what you say. I see that. And you mentioned going back to, we've covered a fair bit of ground, but going back to Jeff Morton's farm. So you went there, and then you worked on that farm for how long?
Well, I worked as a volunteer to start with, just because I wanted to learn whatever there was to learn. And then after a while, I worked there full time for just over a year, and then I worked on other farms, and then I went self-employed and did some violin making and some farm work. So whenever there was farm work that I wanted to do, I did that in preference. So threshing days were always there. Harvest time, I was working there full time. But you know, I'd go riddling potatoes on another farm or whatever it was, and then stay in the workshop on days when there wasn't the farm work to do. So I can't think how long it must have been 5-6 years. I was working with Jeff on and off, and then we moved to Shropshire to try and buy a small holding.
Yeah.
Which we didn't manage because my house in York didn't sell for what it maybe should have, and house prices went up in Shropshire. So we bought a house with a garden, and then we managed to buy a field in 2006, I think it was, which was lucky because it was just before the economic crash, when all these investors decided they were going to buy land, and it shot the price up from 5,000 to 10,000 within about a year or so. So I do what I want to do, or what I can do, with just one horse now, but we did have two at one time. I did try and actually, in that time before we bought the field, I did look into farming, try and get a tenancy. But actually the numbers, I just couldn't get the numbers to work out. Even if I could have got a tenancy, there were some possibilities, but actually it was really, really difficult. And in the end, so I decided not to do that.
Yeah.
I just do what I do now. So I do whatever I do nearly everything with horses that which is mostly haymaking and growing some vegetables.
Yeah.
And which keeps me sane, arguably.
Yeah.
Without the need to sort of make an income from farming, which is always, as you know, challenging.
Yeah, what you were saying earlier in the kitchen about the fact that, there's plenty of time before 9 o'clock.
Yeah.
As well, like you know.
Yeah, that's right. It was because my son has moved, and therefore recently, and hasn't got to commute. So besides saving loads of petrol because he can walk to work, he's also saving an hour each end of the day. And being working at home as I do, it means that I've got the time that I might have been commuting to do stuff in the field. So the other day I went up and down the potato rows and a couple of rows of other vegetables, and then cultivated a patch where I'd put the spoil out of a pond. And I didn't rush at it, but I got it done, and I was still back in the workshop by 9 o'clock in the morning. And so it's just the ways of thinking about it. You've obviously got to have horses that are handy and used to being worked and used to be harnessed to do that. But I mean, even when the children were small and we didn't have any land at all in the winter, and I had one horse, I'd harness her and yoke her up and drive around the block, often with a sledge, knowing that I'll be back 5 minutes before I needed to put the children in the car and get them to school.
Yeah.
But and I did that every morning during the winter. So that was how she got her exercise, but also she got to be familiar with everything, including traffic. But also, there wasn't any messing about, because she knew as soon as I went in their stable, harness would go on and we'd be out and at it. So, and that's a really important thing with horses, actually, is building up an expectation of normality of working. And that's something I saw at the Mortons, and it's something you don't see in stable yards where they have a mixture of all sorts of horses, including sometimes people who've got heavy horses. There's a lot of fussing about, tidying bits of straw and tying up a horse here and mucking out and skipping out, and in fact, over the road from us there's somebody who had two horses, and she had somebody come and help her for 3 hours every day just to look after these 2 horses. They never were ridden or anything, but the 3 hours it used to take them. Whereas if I've got 3 hours, you know, I'll be 5 minutes in harnessing the horse. And then the rest of the 3 hours, except for the last 10 minutes, will be working. You know, it's just the way you go about it is hugely important.
Yeah, keeping it. There's something as well about the process of working with horses as well, that it's quite mindful, and you're present in the environment, and you talk about this in the book as well, and how that's a different thing. And certainly, you know, if I think about farming, haymaking in my past of and present, if you're sat on a tractor all day and you've got the radio blasting or you've got a podcast in your ears, you're not actually present in the environment. And actually, by definition, you're on it'll be a beautiful summer's day that you're out making hay.
Yeah.
And yet you're not really taking it in. And whereas horses.
Yeah, I mean, the thing about using horses is that you've got to have awareness all the time. Now, sometimes if you see somebody who's used to working horses, they seem as though they're doing absolutely nothing, just holding a pair of reins, and the horse is just wandering in front of them or walking intently in front of them, and you're not seen to be doing anything. But you actually got to be constantly alive to what is happening, because the horses have a different way of seeing the world. I mean, they're a prey animal, so they're still looking out for lions and tigers, even though there aren't any. I mean, the other day, there was, when I was rowing up the potatoes, there was a cock pheasant at the far end of the potato rows, and I saw it as I was harnessing up. I thought, I wonder what that looks to be moving. And so I was aware of that all the time I was going up the potato rows, until the horse was aware of it. Now, she's used to that cock pheasant being about, but then it went and hid under a bush. So as she was turning, she was looking a bit uneasily towards that. So I just said, oh, well, that's just that cock pheasant you've seen just a bit earlier. It's really nothing to worry about. And we just carried on. But you've got to be aware of these things, because if the horse is suddenly going to veer sideways because it's not sure what that pheasant is doing, you've got to be ready for what's happening. And also, as I said, with the ploughing and coming across the rut and being prepared to have a good grasp of the plough handles or whatever, that observation of how the horses are working and whether it's easy for them, whether they're walking straight, whether they're holding their head to one side, that automatically makes you much more aware of the job you're doing, how hard it is to pull that particular implement, to how the soil is reacting, as well as the wider things, the potential scary things for horses that might be in the hedge. So it's, compared with driving a tractor, it's just completely different. In fact, there's a chap I was talking to a few years ago, and he big farmer in Nottinghamshire, and he got a tractor that was computer aided as far as driving straight lines. GPS, yeah. But what it couldn't do at the end of the field was turn itself round and go back again. So you need somebody in the cab to turn it around to go back in again. Anyway, he was disking a stubble field, and as he was going along, of course, when you're normally driving a tractor, you're looking behind you, make sure the implement's not working, and then looking ahead to keep going straight, and then looking behind you. And he didn't need to look in front of him, and he was sort of getting mesmerised by the action of the discs, because it's quite, the way it sort of flies out, it turns over. It's quite nice to watch. Anyway, he was busy doing this, and all of a sudden he was jiggle, and he'd forgotten to turn the tractor, and he'd gone straight through the hedge. Well, with horses that would have never have happened. Firstly, because you'd be behind the discs probably, so you'd be looking at the forward all the time and at the discs. And if you'd gone the horses to the hedge, they would have stopped. But that just shows you how divorced from the whole thing you can get.
Yeah, and it's interesting being divorced from the environment, even from the task that you're doing. And, for people that, people talk about mental health crisis, but one of the best antidotes that, I have friends who will go and ride mountain bikes down very steep hills because in that moment you're completely present and you're not thinking about problems or you're not thinking really.
No.
And I guess there's something really positive to spend all day really present in your task. And I guess you have a little bit of that with the violin making as well.
Yeah, it's somewhat different. I mean, I can listen to the radio and do nearly everything with violin making at the same time.
Right.
There's a few jobs where I need all my concentration, so the radio goes off. But certainly with working the horses, I definitely think that you tend to leave your problems at the stable door because, as you say, you have to be completely involved with what you're doing. I mean, once you get used to it, you can think about other things as well. But there's actually quite a lot happening depending what you're doing. I mean, if you're harrying a field, if you're going a bit wobbly, it doesn't really matter except you're having to waste time in covering a bit twice. But for a lot of more precise jobs, you need to be really quite concentrating on what you're doing. But a lot of it is actually, you actually sort of feel it in your hands. And there's a similarity with violin making with that, because once you're used to using an implement or a tool, it sort of could become second nature. So you have got a bit of spare capacity. But I have often found it that I would go to the field and worrying about something and then realise I've been there an hour and I haven't thought about it once.
Yeah. And in terms sort of the history of working horses in the UK, because I might have this wrong, but I think it wasn't really until, is it the 17th, 18th century? Because a lot of cattle and oxen were used for working the fields up. Is that right, up to that point?
Yeah, I always reckon it was about 1750 by the time the horses had mostly taken over from oxen.
Right.
Oxen have got a big advantage in that they can work just off grass, whereas horses, generally speaking, need a bit of extra hard feet when they're working hard.
Right.
But horses work quicker and oxen are much more slow. So once you got the improvements in agriculture sort of around the time of Jethro Tull, and the farms were producing more, then they could afford to feed the horses, which were working more quickly, and so that the start of the build up of speed maybe started back then. But it was a gradual thing. I mean, there was still a few oxen being used in North Yorkshire and in Sussex in around 1900. Not many, but a few. And then horses had it for 200 years from 1750. So what happened was, in late Victorian times, there were steam engines that could plough, but it was a tiny proportion of land that was done like that. They needed big fields to be effective, so big farms. But steam was used for most of the thrashing and also some other, jobs that were based around the farmyard. But otherwise, it was basically horses who did everything. And then the internal combustion engine came in. And the first thing that did really was it enabled the aristocracy to buy motor cars instead of having a carriage. So that happened sort of from about 1900. And then your wealthy industrialists and then the upper middle class started to be able to afford cars. And then the delivery vans started to be mechanised rather than horse-drawn. And then after the First World War, motor lorries started being used. A lot of them were ex-army vehicles.
And would we have lost a lot of horses in the First World War as well?
Yeah, there was a huge number of horses lost in the First World War, but a lot of them were imported from America. They used to import shiploads of American
Really?
horses. Yeah, and there's actually sort of a misunderstanding about what sort of horses as well, because the army didn't actually want the big old clumpy, heaviest draft horses. They actually wanted something that were a bit lighter and a bit quicker, even for pulling the heaviest guns. So, but yeah, I mean, there were the millions of horses were lost during that conflict. So, and then what happened directly after the First World War was that from about 1920, the economy shrunk by about 25%. So it was a huge knock economically. Loads of people put out of work. It sort of prefigured what happened in 1920 in America. So the Depression in Britain started in the 20s and went through till the Second World War. And that did a couple of things as far as the horses were concerned. It meant that there wasn't a market for horses, and also horse breeders had been breeding horses like mad during the First World War, and then they hadn't got a market for them, you know. So and then the farming got in a real sticky state. So if you could grow your own energy to power your motive power, i.e. your horses for farming, you were much better off doing that than you were buying tractors, which had started to come in around the First World War. But it was only really in the Second World War that the tractor really came into its own, partially because they had rubber tyres then. Before they had the iron tyres with strakes that poked holes into the ground, but you couldn't take on a road, and the tractors got more effective, and then Ferguson came out with his 3-point system for the back of the tractor so you could lift implements, and those things really happened around the Second World War. But the bigger thing really was that the farmers who hadn't had anything to do with tractors before the war, they had during the war, because the war agricultural committees would send out the tractors to get work done on various farms, because a lot of the land wasn't being farmed very effectively before. And so farmers got used to tractors. And then in the 1947 Agriculture Act, the government decided we're not going to be so desperately dependent on imports from the colonies. We're going to grow more food at home. And then they started the price support, so that whatever farmer produced, he would get paid a minimum price. And that, of course, was the same system as the European Community, when we became part of it, carried on, and all the subsidies that we all know about. So the other thing with the horse job was that when the farmers started getting subsidies, they could then borrow money, because they were guaranteed a sale for whatever they produced. So they could borrow money.
Interesting.
They could borrow money from the banks to buy the tractors and to buy the fertilizer. And of course, the chemical companies were pushing as hard as they could the fertilizer, because they were making money, and the government wanted more food production, so fertilizers. That was what was all. So
without the subsidies, you don't think that there couldn't have been the same farm lending that there was?
I don't think so, no, because in the 1930s, I mean, farms were going downhill. You know, some land was just not being farmed at all. The buildings were dilapidated, all that sort of thing. So there was just no spare money. So it's definitely, because I mean, nobody's going to lend you money unless they can see a reasonable likelihood of return. And the bank managers could see a huge possibility for return from about 1949-50. And the other thing that did, of course, is in the Second World War, the farmers were earning loads of money because the food was really wanted. So the more they produced, They were getting good prices for it for the first time in a generation, really. And a lot of the small farmers, with the profits they'd earned during the war, and then they got the first lot of tractors and machinery. But I was talking to a chap a few years ago who was farming up near Hexham with horses, and he said the problem was, he said they were earning profits with the horses, but when they were having to pay for diesel and replacement machinery, replacement tractors, the small farmers often weren't making enough money to buy the second lot of tractors, the replacement, when the first lot were worn out. And he said that's why he thinks a lot of the small farmers went out of farming.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because I know my grandmother came here as a very young child. My great grandfather came here from Wales in 1919, and so there's stories about that when they arrived at the farm here. Some people look back and say how easy it was, and that it was a bit easier in the past than it is today. But the three daughters used to have to go over to the farm across the road over there every morning because the well here was tainted, the water well. So they had to carry buckets of water, the three daughters, across the road. My great-grandfather had a son, but he was invalided. And so, and that's every day. If you want to wash yourself or wash your clothes, or the milkmaid's washing before and after milking, and then in the Great Depression talk about how he took lambs to market and didn't get a bid, brought them home, he cut them up, and then he sent his three daughters on bikes into the town with the meat to sell the meat locally. And then that got them a little bit of a name in terms of selling meat. And then my grandmother then set up a shop in Droitwich, in the local town. She started her own grocery shop on the back of that sort of bicycle meat trade. And then off the back of that shop, which got compulsory purchased, she then bought the farm off her parents.
Wow.
So you think, but I mean, it wasn't easy.
No.
But it just shows that sort of hard times, how hard they were, and if you couldn't even get a bid on things, it's just...
it was really tough, and the farmers that I've read quite a lot about it. The farmers who carried on doing the same thing as they'd always done weren't very successful. A lot went out of business, and you could rent farms for nothing because some landlords just wanted to have the land kept right.
Yeah.
It was, generally speaking, the farmers that were a bit more innovative, just like how you're saying, and started doing some retailing. The ones that generally sort of managed to keep going.
Yeah. And I remember that my grandmother saying, because at the time when I was growing up, this was a 180-acre farm, and that was a really big farm to my grandmother, but locally it wasn't really. It was kind of low to middling in terms of size, really, and I think it's probably be considered even smaller now, in terms of how it's considered. But yeah, for 180 acres to be a really big farm, like 70 acres was a big farm.
Yeah.
And just how much that's changed over time. There's much more sort of on the continent. They've, particularly like Austria and Switzerland, often kept that small farm size, haven't they? But
yeah, I think for actually caring for the land, I wonder how you could possibly do it when you've got so much land. I mean, I remember once harrowing a field with 3 horses, and it was a peculiar day. It was in March, and it was sort of foggy and cold, and there was one patch that I think there'd been a pond there, because the field mostly was a sandy loam, but this was clay, and just the amount of extra pull the horses need to exert to get that set of harrows through that little bit of soil was incredible difference. I mean, it must have been 3 times as hard to pull, I would think. And how are you going to know those parts of your farm if you've got huge acres and upon acres. And the other thing, of course, is things like hedges and things. There's a on the road towards Newport from us, there's a field that was obviously been more than one, and it's got a row of oak trees in.
Yeah.
And it's just arable farms. There's never any stock there, and the hedges are all gappy. And those 3 oak trees, you could see they're dying because they've been plying right up to the oak trees. You know, they haven't got any space for their roots. And you know, if you think about all the hedges, the gappy hedges that there are, and the woodlands that are neglected, and there's all that sort of stuff has just gone out the window. I mean, even ditches. I mean, you know, we have got quite significant flooding problems around us, and it's all because people aren't clearing out the ditches. It seems that they don't understand anymore that you need to clear a ditches out. I mean, it's sort of fairly obvious. Water goes downhill, and it needs to, but there's all that sort of stuff, which of course is very intensive of labour and energy, depending on how you do it. And if you've got a huge area, those things tend to go by the wayside, which is, you know.
Well, we definitely noticed that. And at one point we were farming about 1,500 acres, a lot of rented ground, and probably felt like we needed to do that. And I think a lot of that was while, you know, growing the business partly on borrowed money, and then when you've sort of paid off the borrowing, then you can rein back. And so we've shed land, we've got rid of some of the land that we used to have, and so we're concentrating mainly on about 500 or 600 acres. And the difference in terms of the time that we have to focus on land, because it's how you mend a fence. It's like, whether you're just going to patch it up or you're going to fix it.
Yeah.
Does the gate swing? You know, all these little things that actually kind of make you happy you've done a good job. You're often just bodging, just trying to get to next week with your work, but actually having less to look after, you can put more attention and more time into what you're doing and do a better job, be a better steward, I guess.
And it makes life so much easier having a gate that swings, and the fact that you're not going to be woken up at 2 o'clock in the morning by somebody saying your cattle are out on the road because you've not had bits of bodged fencing. Rather, you know, you've actually replaced the fence when it needs to. I mean, it doesn't seem to add up to much, but actually it does, you know, when you're living that life.
100%.
Yeah.
No, very true. You've got there's a lovely chapter in here where you talk about craft, and you bring a few things together in there. I wondered if you talk about that.
I suppose it started, but people, when I was just violin making, and I said, I'm working on a farm, I thought, how on earth can you do the fine, skilled work of a violin maker with his rough old farm work? Well, and I've never believed in that sort of dichotomy, really. I always see things on a sliding scale. I've always liked to see behind what's happening, which is really in a way why my interest in horses came from, because as a child I was interested in things I could understand and how people used to do stuff, because it's much easier to see, how one lever will pull something else rather than something that's hidden inside an engine or something. Now I've forgotten the question you
it was just the craft thing.
Oh, the crafting, but I suppose it stems back from when I used to work on the farm as a teenager, and it was never with my dad because he was the farm manager. It was always with one of the men on the farm, and the stuff that they could do. I mean, it wasn't, it was well respected amongst farming people, that's for sure. But in the wider world, they were just labourers, so they had no skill at all. But of course that wasn't right, because whether it was obvious things like hedge laying or dry stone walling, people recognise the skill craft in that. But even hoeing, I mean, or using a scythe, I mean, one of the whole things I see is people on films using a scythe and they're swinging it about 3 foot behind them and out the other end rather than keep it on the ground. Because they just don't know. There's so many skills that farm workers used to have, and of course there's some skills that remain, that just sort of aren't there. I mean, building stacks of sheaves of corn, like Jeff Morton used to do, or even just loading sheaves of corn onto a vehicle so that they stay put, is 20 times harder than stacking bales on a vehicle, because bales are like Lego, whereas, you know, sheaves of corn are much more soft, and or loose hay, which is like stacking lentils on top of each other. Not slippy, but there's that sort of shape. So all these skills I've always been interested in, because actually mastering a skill is one of the human abilities that is, as far as I'm concerned, fundamental to life. I mean, we've always done it, you know, whether it's, you know, bashing 2 lumps of stone to make a knife out of flint, or, you know, fletching an arrow, or whatever it is way back. You know, we are beings that think not just with our brains but with our hands, and how it works. And so I've always been interested in, you know, the whole range of those skills, and they sort of feed off each other. They're very distant in a way, but it's the attention, I suppose, that there's similarity. It's just as I was saying about when you're working horses, being aware of the environment, the harness, the implement, and the interactions between the things, to sort of refine it and get it to work effectively. Those are similar sort of things that I have in the workshop, where, you know, making a violin, or whether it's in making anything really.
And you try in the workshop to use hand tools rather than power tools, and and what's the reason for that?
Well, it sort of goes back a bit to the Amish thing, because when I started working for myself, I had no power tools except a grinder to reshape tools, and for many years I didn't. And then one year I bought a bandsaw, and I actually timed myself the other day. I sawed half of a front of a belly of a violin with a bow saw by hand, and I sawed the other half with bandsaw, and I timed it, and I also videoed it and put it on my Instagram.
Okay.
And mixed the two together a bit. And the bit I did with the bandsaw took me 4 minutes, and the bit I took with a bow saw by hand took me 6 minutes. Now, if I'd done the back, because the back is harder, that proportion would have been different. It would have been even more slow. You know, it might have taken 3 times as long as the bandsaw. But compared with the cost of the bandsaw, it's immaterial, really. I mean, I could easily have just carried on doing it by hand.
Yeah.
I actually use the bandsaw much more often for things that aren't violin making. Yeah. So if I want to make something in the house, or I want to saw something for outside, you know, that's a big difference. But as on an economic return, the bandsaw is not complete waste of money. But I suppose I've had it at least 20 years, and I don't suppose for within the violin making it saved us money yet.
Yes.
You know, because
that's interesting. Yeah.
And as I say, it sort of goes back to the Amish thing, is what are you actually accomplishing by having that extra machine? So with a bandsaw, I'm not accomplishing all that much really. If I'm feeling a bit lazy, it helps. Or if I've got a cello bag I want to saw into, well, that does save some time. But if you make the analogy like the Amish do, who use horses mostly, and you think, oh well, I want to use that particular machine. Let's say you want to use a mower that isn't a sickle bar mower. Say it's either a drum mower or a disc mower or what the Americans called hay bines, which are mower conditioners. They take so much torque to get them started that it's really heavy if you wanted to do it using ground drive through the wheels of the vehicle. So people tend to use the Amish certainly do, use an engine on a hitch cart and have that power the machine, and then use the horses for the forward propulsion. And that's fine. You know, if you're going to use your engine on a hitch cart to do your mowing, and you're going to use it on a muck spreader, and that's all you do with it, then you may be only going to be using it for 20 days out of the year.
Yeah.
And the rest of the time, perhaps you can use the horses with ground drive equipment.
Yeah.
But if you're having to power that, use that motor on a hitch cart every day to do some job, you're soon going to want to wear ear defenders, because you haven't got a cab that's soundproof like a tractor cab. And so your quality of life is significantly different.
Yeah.
It just depends on how much you want to use it. And of course, then the less you use it, the bigger the capital investment is. So it's, you know, it's quite a balance. So, I mean, for me, if I can do as much as I can without using noisy technology, that's all to the good. I mean, partially because, you know, my hearing is a crucial part of my job as a violin maker. Sure. So I don't want to mess it up by using machines. You know, and even for a minute, if I use a band saw literally for a minute, I still put my ear defenders on. Yeah. Because I know, you know, I remember, you know, the men that worked on the farm in the 70s, a lot of them were going pretty deaf because they'd been on noisy tractors since the 40s without any cabs.
Yeah, it's interesting. I seem to remember. I'm just looking at it there because I think John Seymour's book's up there somewhere. But I seem to remember in that Guide to Self-Sufficiency, he talks about the difference in a home when you're surrounded by furniture or bits of wood that have been put together with hand tools, and some people might scoff at this, but that if something's been ripped apart by a machine, to cut through it is like a violent action, and that this is quite has a different feel to it. Like you feel an old piece of furniture, it feels different, has a different energy to some sort of MDF that's been ripped apart by a...
Yeah, I never quite thought of it in those terms, but I certainly think that if you go into some people's houses and everything is being mass produced, it might be all very clean lines and nicely designed, let's say, but to me it doesn't seem to have much humanity. But you go somewhere else and you get your mug of tea and it's a hand thrown pot. Your eye rests on it for a minute or two, even if you don't talk about it. And once you start building up a house that is full of things that have been made by people, there's a completely whole different feeling about it. With my violins, in fact, I started to realise this when I was at college, because there's one of my fellow students who I sat next to, and we both made 2 violins in this period of time. But one was a Stradivari model and one was a Guarneri model. And when they were played, the 2 Stradivari models and the 2 Guarneri models, they weren't the ones that sounded similar. His was similar to his and mine was similar to mine. And I know that my best work that I do is when that I'm fully engaged and fully concentrating. It's just the same as like when you're working horses. The most effective is when you're absolutely on it, you know, and in the zone, as you might say. So the worst instrument I ever made was a cello, and I made it when I was splitting up with a girlfriend years ago, and I was just all over the place. And I'm sure that's why it didn't sound as good as what I usually do. And so going back to your you know your example, when you're surrounded by stuff that's been made by care, thought, and intention,
Yeah.
then that's that's probably one of the highest ideals you can hope
Yeah.
for, really.
Yeah, and it comes back to that, we're at a point of technology where we can probably choose what's good for us now. We don't have to have just more and more. And I think the focus on the craft, and I certainly feel and see that even with how we work our cows and how we move them and interact with them, there's a craft to that. And then our staff come in and we try and get them to work with the animals gently and read body language and not just be rough and unthinking with them. And I think that does make a difference. But I think also with the craft, I think it's really important principle, and I think you speak of it so well in the book. But I think in terms of education too, we talked a little bit in the kitchen about this, because people are they're kept in the same age group and they move through these year groups and they don't learn from others. And you made the point about learning from working with older people and like the people on the farm that you were working with, and respecting the craft they had in their labours. But I think also in terms of education, it's violin making again, it's obviously with the music element, but when people learn in a music setting, you do your grades, but you're not doing them depending on what age you are. You're doing them on whether you have achieved competence or proficiency, and I think there's something for a lot of kids and a lot of children. Like I've had 3 kids go through school, and some of them are perfectly suited to the academic school system, and it suits them and they fly, and some it doesn't suit, and it can really knock kids' confidence if they just don't think they're succeeding, or they haven't fit into this box of passing these paper exams at the end of each year. But actually having a craft, because if you produce something and you can see it's good and you know how to do something, and if you do it like this, then you'll have this outcome. You don't need praise. You don't need someone else's validation, because you can, a bit like the story in the Bible of like when God created it and saw that it was good. In terms of a child can create something and see that it's good, they don't need someone else's validation. They can, that gives them so much more confidence. And when they have that confidence, because you're not asking someone, you can see it's good. And I think the power of that, and you see it in martial arts as well with the belt system, moving up to black belt, it's about competence. And that competence gives confidence. And I think if we had a bit more of that, a bit more presence as well, I think being present in the world is a very helpful thing. And I think obviously you've got the book here. What did you want to achieve with that? What would you like the outcome to be?
Well, I've spent a lot of time and effort finding out as much as I can about horses and working them in rural settings, mostly in farming. So whether it's visiting people, researching in archives, loads of stuff. And I started writing articles in magazines, the Heavy Horse World magazine and the Small Farmers Journal, which comes from America, because I was finding stuff out that was interesting, and I thought, well, if I find that interesting, somebody else is going to find that interesting too. And after a period of 20 odd years, there's been quite a mass of stuff that I've produced, and some of it I thought this needs to have a more permanent form than just being in magazines, because there's some stuff in that book that you'd struggle to find anywhere else. It's not a book about it's not, if you want to work horses, this is the first thing you need to do. There are other books that do how to do it books. There's some aspects of that, but this has got a different overview made up of all these different articles, because it's unfortunate, but even now compared with when I started, the knowledge of everyday working horsemanship is not as widespread as it was. There's still people doing it, and there's still people who know a lot of stuff. But as it were, this is just my contribution. So if anybody's thinking, well, I definitely want to do this, I wonder how other people do it. I wonder how you might tackle some things. You know, that is something that you might want to buy. Or if you're just wondering in general, how on earth can you possibly use horses nowadays? Again, you know, there's got stuff in there, and how do they fit in with a sort of a more balanced world in terms of energy and the environment? Then there's parts of that. So it's bringing all those things together. That's what I wanted to do.
Brilliant. Yeah, well, I really enjoyed it, and I think it does. There's also a theme in there about the future and because if we don't use working horses, then we'll lose them. And so, but also everything we've talked about today in terms of the future of, do you think that working horses can be part of the future?
It depends how we see the future. I mean, if we think the bigger is better model is going to continue forever, then horses won't have part of the future, and neither will we, because we're just sort of charging towards off a cliff the way we're going. But if we want a more balanced society, if we want to reconnect with natural processes, which we've done the very opposite of over the last 100 years, then horses could well be part of that solution. I'm not trying to say that all farms or all logging should be done with horses or will be done with horses. That's the future will determine that. And it's not to say that you couldn't, for instance, have an electric powered tractor that did some work and some work with horses. We don't know how the future's going to work out, but I know that for loads of reasons, as far as energy is concerned, for soil health, for even for economic reasons, depending on how the economics goes, there's loads of good reasons why people could well use horses again and more. My Jeff Morton used he used to say a lot of interesting things, but one of the things was that he was at sea. He was a merchant seaman from about 1943 until about 1951. So the period when it's gone from horses to tractors, he'd passed him by. So he was still thinking horses. And so for him, the question was never why horses, it was why tractors?
Yeah, I think that's a great place to come to an end. And I think just thinking about all the things we talked about in terms of, how do we want to spend our days? Do we want to be more efficient? And do we want to have more land so you end up managing things in an office? Or do you want to be working in nature with people you like and animals you like as well?
Yeah.
And I think that's an important question for us to think about where we want to go. But I think also looking at the Amish question and seeing how successful they are financially. And I also wonder, with the supply chain shocks we've seen with the Ukraine war and the Iran war and the Strait of Hormuz, and the impact that could have on prices and our ability to produce food. I think even on most family farms, if you could find time for one or two working horses, then when the shit hits the fan and whatever happens out there, you can probably grow your own veg. You can probably grow some for your neighbours as well and do a little bit more. You can enjoy your time out there with the horses, and it gives you an option. And one of the things we're looking at is, at the moment, one of the things we'll say is we can feed 300 cattle in the winter in a day without starting a tractor. And with a horse, you can do similar. And we're looking at ways we can use the horses to feed the cattle, cattle their hay in winter. And you see a lot of this in the States where you have, people, some pretty big ranches, huge numbers of cows being fed every day with horses.
Of course, they've got a big advantage in horses as in parts of the States, is because it's so flipping cold that you can scarcely get the tractors to start. Where the horses, they're always going to start.
Yeah, and the ground's frozen, so it's not too muddy. No, it helps, and a lot of flat areas as well. I think probably does help. But I think there's something there, and I think it's something it'd be great for people to explore. Some resources. Lynn Miller, who wrote the foreword to your book, I've loved his books as well. Really helped me in terms of working horses. He's
probably the first place if you're wanting to actually do it yourself and find out the detail. There's the Working Horse Manual is. No, it's not called that. The Workhorse Handbook is probably the first thing to go to, but he's got other books as well. Yeah, and also there's the magazine, the Small Farmers Journal, which he edits. Yeah, which is worth a look at. There's loads of information on the internet at smallfarmersjournalprobably.com. Yeah,
and I think for people who are really interested in sort of looking into working horses, maybe they've got some experience of riding horses in the past. In our context in the UK, I do think there's no better place to look to start than this book. I really enjoyed it, and I have to say, so it's working-horses.com. I think you can put a message on there, and then William will sort you out with the book.
Yeah.
But thanks ever so much. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Yeah, me too.
And thanks for coming. Thanks, William.
Thanks. Yeah.
Take care. Thanks. Okay, that was Call to the Land. Thank you very much for listening. Please follow us along on YouTube. We're posting everything to YouTube now as well, so you can go and watch there if you'd rather see it in action rather than just listen. Like and subscribe on Spotify if you want to help us out. If this has given you any value, then please do that. If you're feeling really generous, give us a review on Spotify, because again, that really helps us promote. We've got more episodes coming every other Tuesday, so stay tuned and thanks for listening.